about what grew you most as a saint, what grew you most as a minister, what grew you most as a pastor. Hardly ever do they talk about practices. They always talk about people. And you'll find that in your life if you haven't found it already. It's the people who influence us that over time. We start out talking about practices, but really it's people. And this is what Paul did. That's discipleship. That's mentoring. This is what Paul did. And when you're building a church, it's more than having the right pieces in place. It's having the right people around. And so Paul, he draws people around that he wants to invest in. And then he does this inside out thing. He shares his heart and shares his passion, shares his hurts, his dreams, his hopes with people like Timothy and Titus. Now, Paul is not a wimp. He's pretty tough. If you think Paul shied away from confrontation, read Galatians sometime. Because Paul didn't shy away from confrontation. He had no trouble standing up in public or writing a public letter and speaking hard truths. He had no issue. He had no issue reproving or rebuking somebody when their actions called for it and it was going to damage a church. But here's what I would like you to notice. Despite all of that, there is still, to me, a marked difference between the letters Paul writes to churches and the letters Paul writes to people he mentored. There's a big difference. We don't have every case, but we do have a couple of great examples. And in those examples, we see Paul up close, personal, being inside out. He's sharing his heart. Philemon ends up becoming a church leader in Colossae. Titus ends up pastoring a church on the island of Crete. Timothy, he ends up pastoring in Ephesus. On Crete, one of their own philosophers on the island of Crete he says in Titus, Paul quotes it to Titus, one of their own says, they're liars, cruel animals, and lazy gluttons. Titus, go start a church over there. If you can build a church in Crete, you can build a church anywhere. Paul sets up Timothy as pastor of Ephesus. That's a city dominated by the sensual worship of the pagan goddess Diana. But these young men became effective apostolic leaders, and I believe much of it was because Paul, he just shot straight with them. He opened his heart to them. So in two of these cases, with Philemon and with Timothy, we have a treasure. We have the letter Paul wrote to their church, and we have the letter Paul wrote to them. In Philemon, it's Colossians. He pastored a church. The church met in his house, the church at Colossae. And with Timothy, we have Ephesians. So these examples show Paul doing something that I hope we can replicate in this generation. So yes, I'm talking to senior pastors, replicating it with people serving under you. But I'm talking to all of us. Whoever we lead, now or in the future, this is a good model for leadership. So first we go to Colossae. And if you look at Paul's epistle to the Colossians, he does some things to that church, writing to the church. One thing you notice about it is he honors the entire team. He doesn't just talk about Philemon. In Colossians, he honors Tychicus, Aristarchus, Marcus, Justus, Epaphras, Luke, Demas, Nymphas, Archippus. They're all mentioned. And I think that's a good model if we're leading churches. Don't make it all about just this little tiny core of people. What gets rewarded and what gets recognized will get repeated. So he honors the whole team. He warns the church against worldliness. He says, beware lest any man spoil you through philosophy or vain deceit. Don't let somebody take you off into the traditions of men after the rudiments of the world. Don't let any man do that. And then but notice he says, any man. He doesn't name names. He just said, don't let anybody. He doesn't say, watch out for that guy. He just says, it's generic. Beware lest anybody would do that. And then he says, he deals with disunity. He talks to that church and he said, forbear one another, forgive one another. If you got a quarrel against anybody, be like Jesus. He forgave you, and so you forgive others. But notice again, it's generic. If anybody has a problem, he doesn't name names. He doesn't get in the pulpit and point it out. He just talks generically. The guy that I mentioned earlier who fired me in 1990, he taught me a great principle of ministry. And he would say this often: don't take what you're feeling to the pulpit. He always took what he was feeling to the pulpit. I think he felt guilty. But he taught me that. And there's nothing that will make me correct our young preachers any quicker than don't take some issue that we're facing, some stress that we're under, take that to the pulpit and preach about it. Preach about it later when you've had time to pray it through and think it through, and you're calm and you're not in the middle of it. But notice here he's generic. He doesn't name names. Another thing you notice when Paul writes to the church, he keeps this stiff upper lip. He's positive in all of his trials. Here's writing from prison to the church in Colossae. He said, pray for us. Not that God would make them stop beating me, or that God would kill off all the rats in the cell, or that God would let me have some food, or that God would let me out of prison. He just said, pray for me that God will open a door of utterance to speak the mystery of Christ, for which I also am in bonds. He keeps positive. He keeps a stiff upper lip. When you're a leader, when you're a pastor, when you're preaching to a congregation, you don't just dump everything that you're going through on them, because you're trying to encourage them. So this is how he deals with the church. One last thing. There's issues, there's conflicts, there's problems in Colossae. Look at this. He said, I'm writing this letter with Onesimus, a faithful and beloved brother who is one of you. Now, Onesimus is a runaway slave. He's going to write a private letter to Philemon and talk about Onesimus. But he doesn't acknowledge the conflict between Philemon, the leader, and Onesimus, the runaway slave. He doesn't even acknowledge that publicly. There are so many sermons that are preached out of anger issues. That we're mad at somebody not doing what we want, and we're preaching at them in pew 9, seat 3, and the church does not need to hear that. Sometimes we just need to man up and go have a private conversation with somebody and spare the church of the distraction. CCC, we've got problems. We are not going to air those in the pulpit. That's not what I'm talking about when I'm talking about being transparent and open and inside out. You don't start in the pulpit on Sunday morning with that. You start with the people you're touching one-on-one in small groups, your leadership team, the people that you're working with. So notice the contrast here. And we're not going to be exhaustive here. I just want to hit some highlights and leave you with this. Notice now Paul writing to Philemon. So now he's not writing to the church. Now he's writing to the leader of that church. He's writing to the young man that he has mentored. And notice the difference here. He actually confronts Philemon over some things here. And now you know the backstory here. Philemon had a slave called Onesimus who robbed his master, ran away, made his way to Rome, and he meets Paul in Rome. We don't know how. Maybe he got thrown into the same prison as Paul. But somehow he's converted, and now Paul's writing to Philemon, the leader, the pastor, and he's writing about this runaway slave. It's a real issue. So here's what he does. First of all, he starts like this: I thank my God, making mention of thee always in my prayers. Paul said, Philemon, I've been praying for you consistently for a long time. If you're not praying for the people that you're trying to lead, if you're not praying for the people you're trying to mentor, your words are hollow, because you're not doing the number one thing you need to do for them. And we can be very quick to correct, but we need to be quicker to pray first and then correct. He said, I've been praying for you. So he prays first, and then he confronts. And we sometimes get that backwards. We confront very quickly, especially with our inner circle sometimes. But we need to pray first. And then he does this. This is cool. He said, I could command you to take this guy back, because I'm your pastor. I'm your mentor. I'm your elder. I'm the apostle. He said, but for love's sake, I'm going to beseech you, being such an one as Paul the aged, and now also a prisoner of Jesus Christ. Now that's brilliant. He said, I could tell you to do this, but Philemon, I'm not going to tell you to do this. I'm just going to tell you that I'm asking you to do it out of your love for me, out of your submission to me. And you don't have to think about the fact that I'm an aging man, that I'm your elder. You don't have to think about that, but I'm just asking you to do this. Oh, and by the way, I'm in prison for the gospel. He's really doing a number on Philemon right there. What he just did was he played the elder card. And if somebody plays the elder card on you, can I tell you something? If the elder's wrong, God will deal with the elder. But it is a non-negotiable principle in my life to submit to my elders. Now, submitting to elders is the same as wives submitting to husbands. We've got that massacred in some places. I've heard guys teach basically that women are supposed to submit to men. The Bible doesn't say that. The Bible says, wives, submit yourself to your husband. Or the principle is, if you're unmarried, submit yourself to your father. It's not women submit to men. That's some kind of male chauvinist idea that grew up and limited, and I've heard people teach about the order of creation. Well, women were created after man, so women need to submit to men. You were created after the hippopotamus. What are you going to do about that? So let's not make up stuff. And so submitting to an elder is like wives submitting to their husband. A woman's not called upon in Scripture to submit to every man. She's called upon to submit to her husband. Right. You're not called upon to submit to every elder. You're called upon to submit to your elders. Some elders don't know you. They couldn't give you advice about what you're facing in your church. They live in another part of the world. So we respect those elders and we honor those elders. You're called to do something more difficult. You're called to submit to the elders that know you and have invested in you, and that you're called upon to submit to directly. If you don't have elders in your life, you need to get some, and you need to make that a fast priority to get elders. So I'm not called to submit to everybody. I'm called to submit to the elders God's put in my life. It's easy to submit to somebody that doesn't know what you're really doing. Right. It's easy to submit to somebody that has no connection with you. And we've had some of that in our fellowship. I see guys saying, well, so-and-so's my pastor, so-and-so's my elder, so-and-so's my bishop. And he is until they want to do something different. Right. And then they get themselves a new pastor, a new elder, a new bishop. Yep. And that's garbage. You've got to have somebody that you submit to. If there's nobody in your life, I had this discussion a couple of weeks ago with somebody, and they disagree with me, and they're welcome to be wrong. They had an issue with this statement, and this statement is how I operate in my life. I want people, not everybody, but I want people, I want elders in my life, I want a pastor in my life that they have veto power over me. And this guy was taking issue with that. That's crazy. To give somebody veto power over your ministry and veto power over your life, that's crazy. And I respectfully disagree. I need somebody that can pull my coattail and say, Raymond, no. And I welcome that, and I want that. And if you've got the right man of God in your life, they're not going to do that over stupid stuff that would hurt you or limit you. But boy, if you get on the wrong course, and that's how everybody that got on the wrong course ended up there. They didn't have anybody that could tell them no. And so Paul plays the elder card here. Paul doesn't play the elder card with the church. He plays the elder card with the people he's mentoring. Here's what he does. Verse 10, I beseech thee for my son Onesimus, whom I've begotten in my bonds. Paul does this. He puts himself on the line for the underdog. And he basically says to Philemon, I know he let you down. I'm asking you to give him another chance. Philemon, if you consider yourself my son, well, this guy's also my son in the gospel. So I'm asking you, if you consider me your father, then he's your brother, and I want you to receive him. And Paul does that with Onesimus. He doesn't even mention this to the church. He doesn't mention the tension between Philemon and Onesimus. Not to Colossae. He mentions it personally. See, he's doing something different. He's being an inside-out leader. He's mentoring somebody. And so he's very open and transparent with them. Verse 15. Maybe he departed for a season that thou shouldest receive him forever. Maybe God allowed this so that he could leave you. He was just a slave in your house, but now he's been converted. He's a child of God. He's an apostolic believer. Maybe God allowed that so now he could come back and he could be even more of a benefit to the church. Maybe what you thought was irreparable, and maybe what you thought couldn't be fixed, and maybe what you're still mad about, maybe you need to just kind of take a chill pill and just receive him back. And Paul talks very directly. He doesn't do that to the church. He does that to the people he's mentoring. God has no problem turning people's mistakes into miracles. We have a problem with turning people's mistakes into God's miracles. We don't want to let them off the hook that easy. And sometimes you need an elder to step in. Elders tend to be more merciful than we are. They've had a little bit more life experience. And they realize that life softens you after you've seen a little bit. And we need elders to do that for us. One more thing, and then we'll head to our last point here. He says, I have confidence in your obedience. And I wrote this little letter, it's not very long, knowing that thou wilt also do more than I say. Here's the thing you need to have in your relationship with your elders. Paul says to Philemon, I'm confident that you won't just obey the letter of what I wrote. I'm confident that you're submitted to me. So, submission looks like this. Obedience looks like do A, B, C, and I do A, B, C. That's obedience. Submission looks like, what's the spirit behind you asking me to do that, Pastor? What's the spirit behind you asking me to do that, Elder? And I'm going to get a hold of that spirit, and I'm going to do more than you demand, and I'm not going to do minimums. And that's what Paul says to Philemon. He said, I have confidence that you won't just obey. You're going to do more than obedience. You're going to do more than the minimums. Now, that's what he does with Philemon. He writes different to Philemon than he does to the church that Philemon pastors. And now we come to the other example, and this is Ephesus. Ephesus is basically in that century, it would have been a megachurch. It's multicultural. It's in a metropolitan city. It's a city of, we think, maybe 500,000 people. And Paul worked there longer than anywhere else. He stayed for 3 years, and he plants that church. And he warns the elders. This is how he talks to the church in Ephesus. He talks in generic terms, but he gives them a strong warning. When he meets the Ephesian elders, he says, I haven't shunned to declare unto you all the counsel of God. So take heed to yourselves, and take heed to the flock. Feed that church of God. It's the most valuable thing on the planet. God purchased it with his own blood. And he warns the church. Generic terms. No names mentioned here. But he warns the church. He said, after my departing, grievous wolves are going to come. No names. It's generic. But he warns them. They're not going to spare the flock. And of your own selves in the church in Ephesus. No names. Just of your own selves. Be on the lookout, church. There will be people that arise and they'll speak perverse things and they'll draw disciples away after themselves. And you watch and you remember that as your elder and as your first pastor, I warned you. I told you about this. Now that's how he talks to the church. It's generic. No names mentioned. That is not how he talks to Timothy. With Timothy, he has probably the closest mentoring relationship we see in the New Testament. Paul knew something that I know about you. Paul knew that there would be intense pressure on the younger generation of apostolics to change their doctrine and to change their lifestyle. It happened in the first century, and it's happening in our century. And Paul knew about Timothy's generation what I know about your generation. That's why Paul invested his time and his energy and his life and his guts in mentoring that younger generation. He knew there would be pressure on churches to change. He knew there would be pressure from culture and pressure from false brethren, pressure from people changing their doctrine that wanted everybody to go along with them. And he knew that much of the pressure, please hear me, much of the pressure Paul knew would come from former apostolics. If that happened at the end of the first century, don't you be surprised if it happens in our century. Every church leader in the New Testament, all that younger generation, Timothy, Titus, Philemon, all those younger men, hundreds that we don't know their names, they all eventually faced that at the end of the 1st century. They faced the pressure. Every church leader faced that pressure. Look at what John writes near the end of the first century. He said, they went out from us, but they were not of us.
Right.
For if they had been of us, they would have stayed right where they were. They went out that it might be made manifest that they were not all of us. Now that's John the Apostle of Love. And he's writing to the church, and he said, you know, there's people that they left. It's pretty obvious that they never really got this. They never really believed this. All of Paul's letters to the churches, they have similar themes. Commend the faithful leaders, warn against worldliness, warn against disunity, teach doctrine, teach submission. He fortifies them against opposition and persecution. It's the same in the book of Ephesians when Paul writes to them. But in his personal letters, here's what we see. We see Paul writing very directly to men he's mentoring. I hope you have this kind of relationship with somebody in your life. But not just that, I hope you will offer to somebody else this kind of relationship as a leader. These young men, Timothy, Titus, Philemon, they're quickly becoming the leaders in the New Testament church. And if they don't get it right, everything Paul has invested his life in will be lost. And so Paul is a great example of an inside-out leader. He reveals his heart, his hopes, his disappointments, and he talks very specific. Look at what he does. This is Paul to Timothy now. So Paul's writing to this young man who he has spent a good portion of his ministry mentoring. Look what he writes. Timothy, if a man doesn't know how to rule his own house, how can he take care of the church of God? Don't be a novice, Timothy. Don't get all enamored with your position and what meetings you get to preach. Don't get enamored with that, because you can be lifted up with pride and you can fall into the condemnation of the devil. Notice what he does with Timothy. He gets extremely specific on standards for leadership. He calls it like it is to Timothy. He said, Timothy, you got to be careful of your motives. You got to be careful of your heart. You got to be careful of your pride. You got to be careful of that male ego, Timothy. You got to watch it. He gets very specific with Timothy on all of that. Let me tell you something else he gets very specific about. There are times in the local church setting where we're teaching on holiness, we're teaching on apostolic lifestyle. Can I say you need to teach that with compassion, and you need to teach that with wisdom, and you need to teach that with patience. You don't need to get up and drive a bunch of new people out of your church just to make brownie points with some senior saint or some other pastor or some friend. This is about people we're trying to win to God. But notice what Paul does in private, in person, in his letter to Timothy. Look at this. This is where we get this scripture. It's not from a letter to a church. It's from a letter to Timothy. Timothy, in like manner also, that women adorn themselves in modest apparel, shamefacedness and sobriety, not with broided hair or gold or pearls or costly array. Here's something else Paul gets extremely specific on to his inner circle. He lays out holiness standards in detail to them. I lay that out in detail with my team at home. In the church, I'll teach it and I'll be patient. I'll teach principles and we'll be patient on specifics. But not with the leadership team. Not with the leadership team. I'm as specific as I can be. I don't want to see any more of that. I don't like that. Here's why I don't like that. And I ask questions. I'm almost 57. I ask questions. I ask my pastor. I ask elders, why do you do that? What's your feeling on that? One of the challenges that I've had in my area is some of our elders never face the issues we're facing. Our elders don't know what to do about transgender this and sex change surgery that, and they didn't face that. And so in this generation, we've got to wrestle with those things. And Paul got very specific with Timothy on leadership standards, on holiness standards. Here's something else that if you study it, it'll blow your mind. Paul gets specific on people who are wrong, people who have bad motives, people who are in false doctrine. He names names. Not to the churches, to the people he's mentoring. He gets so specific on people that are in false teaching, false doctrine. He gets really specific. I'll show you in a second. We had a 50th or 40th anniversary party, probably 50th, maybe 60th anniversary party for some couple in our church. They've been around the church forever, and their kids get up at this anniversary party. Now, this is a couple, what one can't think to criticize, the other can think to criticize. They're just kind of negative. They've been around for years. I don't know if we've ever done anything right. And we just know this. We've heard them. Their kids get up and said, we've never heard Mom and Dad say a negative word about anybody. I wanted to stand up in the back and say, liar! But can I tell you, my kids are never going to stand up at my funeral and say, it's not going to happen. We never heard Dad say a negative word about anybody. Because I've said lots of negative words about lots of people. I've said, don't you go around them. They don't believe fat meat's greasy. They don't believe anything. And you need to watch out for them, and you need to. So I haven't been always positive. To me, everybody's not this bland flavor of vanilla, and we're all doing fine, and everybody loves No, I warned my kids, and I warned my team about false doctrine and people, and I name names. I've said to some of our preachers, that guy's, he's a kook. I don't care if he's still UPC. He's a kook. I name names. If somebody's straying, because I value what they're going to do in the next generation of the church. Now, I don't get up in our church. You will never hear me get up and bash somebody by name. You won't hear me bash another UPC minister. You won't hear me bash any minister. You won't hear me bash denominations. You won't hear me take a cheap shot at a mega church pastor, not in a public setting. You will not hear it, but privately, that's part of my job. I want to be an indicator of follow this, don't follow that. Listen to this, don't listen to that. Now you may not believe this, but let me show you. So to the church in Ephesus, Paul's like doing the big generic stuff. Hold on to truth. Watch out for wolves. Watch out for false teaching. He never names a name. Look what he does with Timothy. Of whom is Hymenaeus and Alexander. I delivered them unto Satan, so they'll learn not to blaspheme. When I pray for them, I pray that the devil gets a hold of them and thrashes them good so they get tired of it and they come back to truth. That's what he said. Look at this one. This thou knowest, all they which are in Asia be turned away from me, of whom are Phygellus and Hermogenes. He names names. Those guys aren't worth following. Those guys I don't want you hanging out with. I don't want you to go and listen to all their talk because they're in trouble. They've turned away from me. And if they've turned away from your elder, you don't need to be around them. He says this. You don't believe this, but he does. He names names. Their word will eat as doth a canker, of whom is Hymenaeus and Philetus. He said, what they say, it's so twisted that it eats people away like a disease. It destroys faith. It destroys godliness. It destroys holiness. Their word eats like a canker. Stay away from those two. And he names their name. He doesn't do this in a church setting. He does this to the people he's mentoring. He does this. Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world. He's departed unto Thessalonica. Demas forsook me. He's worldly. Stay away from Demas. He does this. Alexander the coppersmith did me much evil. The Lord reward him according to his works. I'm praying that God smites the guy.
Coppersmith.
That's what an elder talks like in private. Now he's wise enough. He doesn't talk like that in the pulpit. But if you got an elder in your life, that elder will say to you, that guy's bad news. That ministry's bad news. That direction is bad news. You need that in your life. Wow. He does this. The love of money, Timothy, is the root of all evil. There's some guys in ministry that they covered after money and possessions, and they've erred from the faith. They got so focused on money that they pierced themselves through with many sorrows. He warns Timothy about money. He warns Timothy about the trap of materialism. He warns Timothy about this. Get away from youthful lusts. He talks to Timothy very plainly about sex and lust. And he said, Timothy, you need to follow righteousness. You need to have a pure heart. He talks to Timothy about worldliness. He said, Timothy, you know some of those peers of yours? They have a form of godliness, but they deny the power thereof. Stay away from them. Now, we don't talk like that in the pulpit. But you need some people in your life that can actually open up their heart to you. And furthermore, if you're a leader of a team, you owe it to them to say, you need to stay away from that influence. This is what leaders do when they're leading with their heart. They're open. You might not like that, but it's in your Bible.
Wow.
And I try to do that with my team. I've said. Now, Beverly keeps telling me not to use the word idiot in the pulpit. So I don't. Out of honor to my precious wife, I always stand to the side of the pulpit before I say the word idiot. Every single time. In fact, now I point it out to the church.